Good morning, everyone. How are you? Off to a great start. I hope on this Monday, the last Monday in April, and I have a lot of Book of Excellences to share with you. It is one of those things that we get going on, and then I never have a chance to make a recording. I've been doing I Learn testing for the last 2 weeks. I got a few more to finish next couple days, and then we should be finished with that for the school year. But these students have shown great life skills, so we need to be praising them. Heidi Elam for effort from Mrs. Ferger and Lord. Emmett Powell gave good effort as well from Mrs. Storms. Carmen Simpson, cooperation from Mrs. Uckman in speech. Thank you. Layla Leone for problem solving from Mrs. Harris, as well as Chloe Hughes. Um, Naya Allen from Mrs. Storms for effort, and um, Tyler Blevins, way to go, from Mrs. Storms for effort as well. Mrs. Early, Aubrey McDaniel, way to go, gave great effort, and Maddie Lowry passed her plus 10s. Mrs. Early, great effort as well. Mathis Beck, effort from Mrs. Early. Jasmine Hill from Mrs. Storms for effort, as well as Finley Russell for problem solving. Tedley Walker for initiative from Mrs. Harris. Huxley Scott Spears from Mrs. Harris. Gabby Bice for effort from Mrs. Early. Della Ellis from effort from Mrs. Uckman. She already reached her 2 goals. And Emma Coleman also for speech from effort. Joe Vo for effort from Mrs. Storms. And Rosie Mitchell for problem solving from Mrs. Reichert. Grace Russell for effort from Mrs. Reichert, um, as Eric Vaught for Mrs. Effort, for effort for Mrs. Harris. Jackson Thielen and Jackson Thielen for doing the right thing for Mrs. Uckman's speech, and Justin Garrett, personal best for Mrs. Reichert. Got to give Justin some praise. He wheeled up here in his wheelchair, broke his leg on a motorbike, and he's showing lots of grit, so we appreciate that. Abby Burnett signed it once. She signed it twice. She signed it 3 times, Mrs. Storms, for her effort, as well as her sister, Allie Burnett, signed for effort, and Gabe Perrette for effort as well from Mrs. Storms. Josie Holt from Mrs. Harris for problem solving, and Jackson Henninger for treating people right from Mrs. DeFries. Maddie Livingston from treating people right from Mrs. DeFries, as well as Barrett McFadden, Emma Vaught, Cora Hancock, Tessa Johnson, and Evelyn Mills, all for efforts. Mrs. Ferger says Taryn Garrett for responsibility for student council, um, and Naveen Santiago Garcia for Mrs. Storms for effort. Layla Richards for effort from Mrs. Sheets. Lincoln Foley for effort from Mrs. Storms. He signed it twice. Mrs. Harris, excuse me, from Lincoln Foley. Kara Ferger for kindness. Kara did a really nice thing for us. Mrs. Oakley and Mrs. Cook found reason to praise. We had a family here that needs some help finding some books, and Kara took them and helped them find that. Avery Bachman for personal best, not once but twice, from Mrs. Harris. Piper Peabody for problem solving and initiative, and Fermin Munoz for effort as well. Super job. Meadow Wilkinson for personal best from Mrs. Sheets, as well as Katie Bainsden. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, Mrs. Sheets, for effort. Um, Malin Russell for effort, not once, not twice, but 3 times for Mrs. Sheets. Um, Baylor Beck for effort from Mrs. Sheets. Bo Burgess for effort from Mrs. Elam. 100 sight words. Kinsley Cooper, Aoife Thorne, Henry Blackbird, Bridley Martin, Jace Clausen, Henry Slaughterbeck, Astrid Ramirez, and Emma Coleman, all from Mrs. Elam for 100 sight words. Jesus Delone Pareto for effort from Mrs. Sheets, and Noah Henninger for effort from Mrs. Storms. For Mrs. Sheets, these students gave good effort. These are all sheets. Are you ready? Hayden Rogers, Maddie Burton, Navalia Santiago Garcia, all for effort. Sadie Trader, not once, but Sadie Trader twice. Sadie Trader 3 times for effort. Scout Peabody. Rowan Guesswine, Presley Hallis, Presley Hallis, Presley Hallis, Presley Hallis. Way to go, Mr. Sheets. Cole Beckstroth, who is a state champion in gymnastics. We just heard that from his mom this morning. 100 sight words, too, so way to go, Cole. Personal best, Mrs. Early's class. Camilla Acosta Magallanes. Personal best, Mrs. Early. Mrs. Harris says, Kendall Downham, problem solving. Lincoln Kessler for effort from Mrs. Storms. And Samuel Vaughn for effort from Mrs. Sheets. And Samuel Vaughn again for Sheets. Christopher Jenkins for effort. Cal Rockhill for effort. And Roden Russell for perseverance. Roden Russell for effort. Isabella Lewandowski. Isabella Lewandowski for effort. Owen Disher for effort for Mr. Sheets. Drew Jansing. And Davina Paget, all for effort for Mrs. Sheets. Allie Sipple for problem solving for Mrs. Marks. Bella Martin for problem solving for Mrs. Tilley, Mrs. Cook, and Mia Gordon for problem solving for Mrs. Tilley. Layla Leone for problem solving, Layla Leone for effort, Layla Leone for effort for Mrs. Harris, and then for Mrs. Storms twice. Huxley Scott Spears for problem solving for Mrs. Harris, and Hadley Peabody for cooperation for Mrs. Ferger, Mrs. Lord. Layla Richards for effort from Mrs. Storms. Charlie Livingston for effort for Mrs. Ferger. Gannon Fisher for effort for Mrs. Storm. Bryce Short for common sense. Way to go, Bryce. For Mrs. Reichert. Anthony Valdez Cruz and McCrae Kaiser and Naveed Santiago Garcia, all for effort for Mrs. Storms. Tatum Reichert for effort for Mrs. Sheets, and Tatum Reichert again. Mary Gardner, plus 10s, her effort for Mrs. Early, and Charlie Tolliver, personal best from Mrs. Early. And that is it. We have a lot going on this week and next week and the week after. So this week we have Fishing Club, Mrs. Lord and Mrs. Ferger. Thank you for doing that after school for fifth grade on, I think it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, we have an amazing day. We have fourth grade goes to Camp Tecumseh. How fortunate are we that we have the Parks Trust that pays for the cost of that trip for all the chaperones and the students. So there's zero cost. That's usually about a $50 trip. So that's amazing that they do that. So thank you. And Mrs. Wright and Mrs. Burke for staying overnight and all the effort that goes into that and all the parent volunteers. We also have our plays going on in fifth grade, and then they're doing a bill day on Wednesday, and then they're going to do dress rehearsals this week. And then on Thursday, we have really something kind of cool. Mrs. Harris and Mrs. Oakley have worked really hard on making that happen, and that is called Nature Quest with Monica Christopher from the Tippecanoe Soil and Water Conservation, and they are going to have all sorts of activities outside. It's supposed to be beautiful. We also are being joined by Mentani Elementary. They're bringing 91 second graders to join as well. So very exciting stuff going on. The next week we have plays. We have Keep Stockwell Beautiful for the fifth grade walk to Stockwell and clean up. We have all sorts of celebrations and field trips going on starting next week. The last month of the year is really full of great things. So we look forward to that. So anyway, Book of Excellence, super job. Proud of everybody. Thank you for playing along and have a great week.